Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Genia Kostka on local green politics in China. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week it's my pleasure to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation an expert on some issue of global governance, international public policy. And today I'm very happy to welcome Genia Kostka, who's Assistant Professor of Chinese Business Studies at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management and also a visiting fellow this year at the Balsley School. So welcome, Genia. Nice to have you come in. In this series, we often do a lot of big picture topics, looking at the world from a macro global governance kind of perspective. Your work is a little different, looking at things from a micro level, bottom up. And of course, these are both important, but I imagine rather different ways of approaching problems. And so you do green politics, and you look specifically at China. So maybe we could start by just having you give us a little background on how you got interested in this and how you went about designing the research that you've been conducting and just come back from China and a little bit about some of the things that you found there.
So yes, my research looks at green growth in China, and I'm interested how China is now moving from a model of growth at any cost to a more sustainable growth pattern. And that's of course very challenging for a country as big and diverse as China. And I became interested in this topic when I did more field work in central China on how private sector is developing. And I more and more realized that there are certain limits to growth because the air was more polluted. There was also more and more environmental protests. And so in the last 5 years, this topic of environmental issues really increased in terms of importance within the country. And so seeing and living in central China, breathing the air, I really learned, I started to think about how can a country with such high growth demands grow at the same time also protect the resources. And that's a challenge that will continue for China in the following years. And I spent mainly my time really doing field work, so I talked to local government officials at the very local level. And there you actually really understand the very competing priorities they have. Environmental issues are just one of many issues on their agenda. And doing fieldwork and seeing it from the local view adds another very complexity to the topic.
Now, those of us who just know about this subject from reading the newspapers will not have read anything about local green politics in China, so we have a lot to learn from you. But we also get the impression that China is, in the grand scheme of things, a problem for climate change policy, that it's one of the countries that won't agree to binding commitments, binding ceilings on emissions. It won't agree to strict timetables. So when you say that China now realizes it has to be green, is that a realization that's primarily come from the top, or has it percolated up from the bottom to the top? And what's the balance in China between national green policy and local green policy?
So the priority was definitely came from the top. And I think you have to look at the top leadership. Many of the people in the State Council have PhDs in science. So already very early in the late 90s, there were commissions set up to address climate change, much earlier than many other countries. And so the leaders, the top leaders, given maybe because they have a scientific background, much earlier listened to the science facts. And already in early 2000s, when energy intensity, for example, increased in China, they started to really develop national plans. So I think what's interesting about China, people often see China as a country that doesn't want to do anything about climate change, but you have to differentiate between what they're willing to do at the international level, and there they don't want to do much in terms of committing to binding targets. But at the local, at the domestic level in Beijing, there have been real push for this topic. The problem, of course, is that there are really different challenges because Beijing leaders, their main goal for keeping legitimacy is growth and stability. But now, given that there's so many environmental protests, environmental issues have become a threat to stability. And so leaders have in the last since 2005 especially, included what we call environmental targets in national 5-year plan. So China has run that every 5 years, the National Development and Reform Commission revises targets for the entire country. And in 2005, for the first time, there were 3 binding targets at the national level. Now, already we have as many as 9 environmental binding targets. So they keep adding new environmental targets, which shows that they really take that seriously. And they and the way it works is they're binding because these targets then get triggered down from the national level to the provinces. So there are 31 provinces, and each province then takes these targets and again allocates them to the municipalities and counties. So this triggering down of targets works very well in China. Of course, other countries, I've done also field work in India, they don't have that abilities to set a target at the national level, and then there's no decentralized structure. So China benefits from its, let's call it decentralized authoritarianism system, because Beijing can set targets and then give it to the local governments.
And they're enforceable.
They are enforceable most of the time. And how are they enforceable? Like Beijing is using an existing system which is called the cadre evaluation system. So every government official gets yearly targets. Usually they're like 20 or 30 targets, and environmental targets are just some of them. But some of these targets are so-called hard targets. You must meet them. If you don't meet them, you can't get promoted, or you can't get your yearly bonus. So that really incentivizes government officials to prioritize certain targets. And environmental targets, like energy intensity, is a binding hard target.
And if they can do this domestically, binding enforceable hard targets, why are they unwilling to make commitments internationally, which I imagine would lock in some of their comparative advantages, especially if they do have a bit of a head start over other developing countries on development of green technologies specifically?
I mean, there's certainly historical factors. China has, foreign powers have meddled into Chinese domestic politics. So the way I see it is the leaders in Beijing want to keep their independence and not be hold to account of certain targets. So and they see environmental and climate change issues mainly as a domestic issue in terms of energy security and pollution. So for them, it's actually much more a domestic focus than the international one.
Fascinating. We'll be back again in a minute with Genia Kostka. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So situating China in the larger climate change debate, it's a particularly vulnerable country, isn't it? It's got limited water resources, large populations living in low coastal areas susceptible to sea level rise, dust storms, sandstorms. I guess this is a country that really should take green growth seriously. How are they going about it? First of all, do they have the resources to do it? And secondly, what are they looking to specifically to try to meet their own green standards?
Yes, I think climate change is a lot about state capacity. And so China, I would categorize as a country with relatively high state capacity. So the state is actually able to really devise certain regulations or mechanisms. But for China, it's also not easy. So at the moment, they really experiment with market-based mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms. But what we see mainly these regulatory command and control mechanisms work. So the market-based mechanisms like voluntary carbon markets, it's not working as well. So they use, for example, these targets. This is something they have done for many years. They have used targets for the one-child policy. They now apply these instruments also for environment. But there are, of course, challenges because environmental issues are very different than the one-child policy. And if you actually go to the local level and you talk to the environmental protection bureaus, you realize that there's still a lot of loopholes where you can, I call it play with numbers, where you can find loopholes and you officially fulfilled the target, but you actually did not. And this happens for all sorts of environmental targets. So there's some challenges in China. Many ministries, they are aware of some of these problems and they keep revising the target system, they keep adjusting it, and they also created some flexibility. Let me give you an example. For example, energy intensity targets. So that's a target which is important because energy security is definitely one of the top environmental issues. So they have been first set in the 11th five-year plan, a national energy intensity target of 20%, where you reduce energy intensity by 2010 compared to, by 20% compared to the 2005 level. And the way China did it was really, and I call it state signaling. So like Wen Xiaobao, the national leader, went on TV, said we need to use the iron fist, the iron hand to enforce that target. And local leaders are very perceptive to these signals. Again, because they get evaluated very strictly. There's a lot of competition among local leaders to get promoted because they're much more local, like at the county level, there are many cadres or officials who want to get promoted, but very few slots. So there's very tight competition. So they're very careful to watch what the leaders at the national level, what are the next signs. And so it was very clear that energy intensity will be a topic. But at the end of the five-year plan period, when they had to show that they met the target, many localities were struggling. And in order to meet that binding targets, for example, they cut electricity of hospitals, of businesses, and there was a lot of complaint by the public who suddenly, even residential areas, and they really complained by this very short-sightedness. And I mean, the leaders then saw the situation and really adjusted the targets in a way that now you don't have five-year, like the emphasis is no longer on these five-year targets, but more on annual energy intensity targets to avoid this last cramp we've seen in the 11th five-year plan. So the point is that they used existing structures like the target system, but they're revising it and trying to adjust for like the shortcomings that are clearly there.
Now, is there a single overall target, or are there sort of sub-ceilings that will reduce your energy intensity and fossil fuels in this much and boost it in wind this much? Do they take source balancing into account or not?
So the way they work is they have a national target of 20% and then they give it to provinces. And what's like an advantage of the target system, they adjust the targets for different provinces. So some provinces who are more coal intensive, for example, and who have much more energy inefficient enterprises got a higher target, like let's say Shanxi or Inner Mongolia. So they got a target of 24, 25% in the 11th five-year plan. Other provinces who are still need to develop got lower targets. So that's how they adjust, depending on the economic development and the industrial structure of a province, they give them different targets. And then the provinces, again, look at different localities, what kind of enterprises are there, and again, differentiate. But that, interestingly enough, has led to local politics of target allocation. So now the provinces and municipalities and counties, they discuss which locality should get how much, what kind of targets. And so they use actually the common but differentiated responsibility language that is used at the international level is now used at the local level. And they're very hot debates because it is, if you get a higher target, it's a higher burden.
Does this create the impression that there are winners and losers in this scheme? And does that generate serious tensions at the local level or between provinces?
Oh yes, it's the problem with target setting, it's similar to standard setting, is always, it's very hard to set the right target. It's so the entire target system, it actually starts off selecting a target, allocating it, implementing it, and verifying it. And at each step, there are real problems. And already selecting a target, if you select, for example, SOD or CO2, you might neglect another target. Like, for example, China neglected for many years particulate matters. which is creating dust. And the same with allocating targets. If you give some more, they feel maybe unfairly treated and they complain. Others, and you see it at the localities. Sometimes they really say these targets are very hard. Some localities say the targets are manageable. So it is actually a problem in general with the system. To find the right target is tough, especially because often the governments who set the target don't have the scientific capacity to really do the research on, for example, sector-based research on which kind of industries have more scope to really reduce energy.
Right, yeah, challenging puzzle to try to put together. We'll be back again in a moment with Genia Kostka. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Okay, so let's go very local now, and you've done a lot of field work and you've seen things on the ground. You mentioned that there were a lot of protests, environmental protests in China. Are these generally protests against environmental policies, or are they protests against poor environmental practices or poor environmental conditions? What direction do the protesters push?
I mean, there are all sorts of protests. Some estimates go 50,000 a year up to 80,000. I mean, no one really has exact figures. But given the numbers, you can imagine there are different reasons. But the biggest protests have been often when a factory comes into a locality and produces very visible pollution. Or there have been chemical leakages into the water. So the famous one are in Xiamen. So often, and we call them not in my backyard protests, NIMBYism.
Right.
And so it's often locally initiated protests. But you see more and more also that some students get engaged with NGOs. The numbers of NGOs have risen, so they sometimes also support more organized protests. But the main numbers are usually in rural areas where a factory has really affected people's life.
And do you ever see protests against onerous environmental requirements? For example, if electricity is cut off, do you get spontaneous protests and people want the coal-fired electric plants turned back on? Or is it all on the other side of the issue, that it's sort of poor environmental practice and poor environmental consequences that tend to trigger the grassroots protests?
I mean, mainly it's a poor environmental management. The regulate, sometimes you have businesses who complain, but I mean they have connections or they go to the government, but they don't do very visible protests. But yes, you really see all sorts. But it's interesting that sometimes even if there's a local pollution, now sometimes the government just pays off the people who protest. And that way it has become almost a lucrative way for certain people. They rather get the compensation payments and accept the pollution instead of really keep fighting. So there have been real change of thinking in terms of the government side, that they're willing to very early step in, offer some compensation or act as a negotiator between the businesses and the local people.
We don't often think of China as a protest-friendly country, though, right? Unless the protest is against Japanese policy or something like that. But does the regime consider these kinds of environmental protests a threat?
Yeah, absolutely.
And do they try to quash them, or?
I mean, they use.
Is there police action, in fact, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of responses. I mean, surprisingly, first they try to really do it through payments or through other negotiations, but there have been, of course, more forceful responses from the police. But usually these protests get solved, and if not, I mean, there are always other ways. The government might convince the business to move to another locality and offer them free land elsewhere. So there, because the government has so much state capacity and owns so much resources, it has much more tools to try to step in case of crisis. But that said, in many cases, governments are also very much overlook these protests and try to intimidate protests, like the leaders. And I mean, there are many cases where people have been also imprisoned, put in prison. So it's hard to generalize. And given that most of these protests happen in rural areas, there are very few good studies that have really highlighted it.
We hear a lot also increasingly about corruption as a general problem in Chinese politics. Is that a problem on green politics? Is it frustrating the meeting of targets, or is it resulting in, as you suggested earlier, skewed or dishonest reports about performance?
I mean, corruption is a daily happening in China, and many enterprises were used to pay a fee in order to continue pollution. But because targets have been more strict, and especially targets where there are monitors, and it's getting harder for the local Environmental Protection Bureau to accept these fees and allow these companies to pollute, because simply there are increased air monitors or water monitors. And so the scope for corruption has become less. And I think, for example, the big enterprises now, they report their energy usage not only to their local government, but also to the provincial level or even to Beijing, depending on their size. So this, of course, allows for less opportunity to corrupt, because this data is not only given to the local government, who of course are more are good partners for corruption, but if a big state-owned enterprise now reports this data to Beijing, it's much harder to find to make the effort to find a good partner to pay some money.
And what do we see in China by way of incentives or programs to promote genuinely clean energy sources, things like wind or solar? Is there an aggressive program, and is that centralized, or is that something that the provinces would deal with individually?
I mean, the big signals, again, and the direction is set in Beijing. And so there are also lots of national subsidies for wind, solar, I mean, for all sorts of green programs. Tax, you can, if you buy certain technologies, you can get tax benefits. So they're real like programs. And interestingly enough, then at the provincial level, often they copy these programs. So let me give you an example. They've, at the national level, they identified the top most energy using companies, the top 1,000. These were big state-owned chemical, cement companies. And some provincial governments saw, we have now the national top 1,000 companies, and they just did the same. They copied, imitated this, and they had developed a provincial top 1,000 enterprise program. So they work with big enterprises, identify areas where they can be better in terms of air pollution or water or energy. And then they develop also provincial subsidy programs. And they're very creative. For example, one province started to tax the coal they were mining and exporting. They just introduced a tax on coal and used that money to finance any restructuring, any green program. So they set up a sustainable fund, and any new project could apply. So they're all different ways that have been devised.
Fascinating. We'll be back one more time with Genia Kostka. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. I want to use some of our remaining time to talk about the lessons that you've learned that we might take from China's experience. But before I do that, I'm really curious to know about the level of consciousness in China of climate change in general as a global problem. You've described a high level of awareness of local pollution issues, which are sometimes very different from the the climate change issues, you don't see it on a day-to-day basis, whether the Earth is warming. Are people in China aware of it at the grassroots level, and do they care about it, or are their concerns very, very much focused on the local clean water, the local clean air, and that kind of thing?
This is a very good question. So when I did research in 2005, people at the local level really, when you ask what are the top priorities, for example, for your local government, environment or climate change was never mentioned. And now it's mentioned. It doesn't mean at the local level they really proactively do something, but because of this target setting system and the signals from Beijing, it has at least arrived at the top of the agenda, and it's a typical topic that officials say they're really concerned about the environment and about climate change. They use that word before it was did not exist in the vocabulary of a local official. So that's good news. I mean, but reality still is that at the local level, unemployment is high in China. There is a lot of issues on land reforms. There's healthcare issues. So it's still only one of many issues. And the problem is climate change. If you, let's take energy for intensity or efficiency again, in order to really meet and improve energy intensity, you need to often close inefficient enterprises, and that impacts local growth. And so there is a real contradiction. That's a word officials at the local level use a lot, between growth needs and climate change. And they have used very creative ways of bundling different policies together. So they use now, for example, used energy intensity targets. In order to meet them, they realized, actually, let's close small energy inefficient enterprises that also create a safety hazard, because many coal mining companies are really causing mining accidents. And so the local officials try to think about how can they bundle climate change policies with other relevant policies. And so they bundled it with safety issues. They also often frame it as technology upgrading when they ask companies to upgrade boilers. So they don't say it's because of climate change, but they say in the long term this will be better growth. It's really upgrading. And so they're very creative now in order to address, on the one hand, their own targets, but also make sure they have local support.
Now, a lot of the climate change specialists here in the West say that there's no hope for a viable solution to the climate change problem that doesn't include carbon taxes. Does China have carbon taxes? And if so, are they national? Are they local? Are they provincial? Are they discretionary?
I think they're debating it, but what they did, they introduced in the new 2011 five-year plan carbon intensity targets. So at least for the first time, the carbon has been put on the agenda, and it has not arrived yet at the local level. So when I was in China last year, I asked about this carbon intensity target. People said, yes, we know it exists, but we haven't given instructions what to do. So there's a lot of further education to be done on that topic.
Still percolating down. Yeah. So lessons. What can we here in the West and other developing countries learn possibly from what you've seen in China?
Yeah. I mean, I think the key is to really look at existing state capacity. I mean, that's a starting point. And China has used an existing structure, which is cadre evaluation. They already had a system in place where officials get evaluated every year, and they just incorporated environmental targets into an existing institutional structure. So I think every country is different, and it's of course very country specific what kind of state capacity you have. Like India doesn't have the decentralized structure like China, and India has used a much more market-based approach where the state makes sure private sectors are involved. But the key lesson is from China is look at what are existing structures that a country has and try to then incorporate it. And that's, I would say, is lesson number one. Lesson number two is, and I mentioned it briefly, this bundling. Climate change is one of many competing priorities, not only in China, everywhere. And so I think it's very important to think about, from the local perspective, what kind of possibilities exist to combine climate change with other competing priorities. So in China, we've seen like energy was combined with safety. worker safety or with like, for example, employment issues. So there needs to be like very much more awareness of what's happening at the local level and how can you combine so you bundle different interests also together.
And is there any evidence that the push towards greener growth in China is actually reducing growth and possibly threatening the legitimacy of the regime?
It's a very, very good question. I mean, right now the regime is using the environmental targets actually as a legitimacy enhancing tool. So they say, oh, we have all these environmental targets, look, we are doing something. But at the local level, it's of course different because some regions who have actually really closed certain enterprises have had declining growth. And they now really are in very heavy debates. So they try to restructure their economies, try to find new patterns of growth, but that's a very long-term path, and it has created to some voices at the local level where there is trends again almost to go back again and say we can't be too green.
Very interesting. Well, I've learned a great deal, and I'm sure our audience also has, and so thank you very much for coming in and helping us understand local green politics in China much better. And to our audience, please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.